Hey folks, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix background vocals to sit further back in your track. We're going to be going over giving your background vocals some extra depth today, but before we dive in, if you're ready to take your vocal mixes to the next level and really start dialing in your EQ strategy when it comes to mixing vocals, then I have just the thing for you. It is my ultimate guide to vocal EQ, and it's just a simple PDF that will walk you through how to EQ your vocals step by step to help you get polished and professional sounding vocal mixes without any more of the guesswork. It is a completely free guide, and you can download it below using the link in the video description. Now let's jump in here and let's take a look at these background vocals. I'm going to hit play here. We're going from the verse section into this pre-chorus section here. And all these background vocals are a little accent piece for this second pre-chorus section, and they kind of work as a little swell or transition into, our chorus section. So take a listen here. So you can hear they kind of sit in a spot where you hear them come in, you hear that nice air and that depth on the side of the track, but they don't sit up front, they aren't intrusive, they don't sit over any of the other tracks here. They leave plenty of room for our guitars and our vocal to shine through in the spots they already sit in, and they blend really, really nicely into our next section. You don't hear them drop off, but you don't kind of miss the space they inhabit either, which is really, really nice, and that's kind of what we're going for here by pushing them a little bit further back in the track here. We just want to get the depth and the width from them without having them contribute too much impact to the track. So when they're gone, we don't necessarily miss them. We don't want our chorus drop to feel like it's missing something because the background vocals aren't there anymore. So take a listen, and I'll solo up our background vocals. We got that nice tail on the end. So I'm doing something a little bit different, especially for me on these background vocals. Usually on any kind of vocals, I like to send to the reverb, but we're actually going to be putting the reverb directly on these vocals here today. But let me take everything off, and you can hear where we started with these background vocals here. So you can hear we're really just achieving that goal of pushing these further back and making plenty of room for everything else that's already there to keep shining in the spot it's already in. We don't want to push anything else forward or have to do any extra EQ in this section to make sure everything stands out above these background vocals. So we'll start with just our first EQ, just a couple moves here. You can see we're taking out a huge chunk of the mid-range, but the first thing we're doing is pulling out the bottom end here. So take a listen. We got a high-pass filter at 177 hertz, 12 dB per octave, wiping off all that low end. With vocals like that are stacked together, sometimes you can get buildup in the bottom end, be it for breaths coming into the vocal phrase that can build up sub-area, or any kind of noise going into the microphone. So without, and then with the high-pass filter. Not making a huge difference, it's a subtle move, but we're rolling off just a touch of this low mid area with it as well. So you can see I came up right to the bottom end of where our background vocals are sitting here, around 200 hertz, and then we roll off just a touch above it as well. It helps to soften the bottom end on the background vocals. Now we're going to do a huge cut here in the mid-range. This is going to make room for everything else that is already there. So our vocals straight up the middle, as well as our electric guitars and our keyboard that are sitting out wide. When these background vocals come in, we don't want to cover anything. We just want to add that air and that depth so they contribute that kind of smooth transition into our chorus here. So this is our move to make room here. Take a listen without and then with this. This is about a 7 dB cut at 500 hertz. You can see we're moving more towards kind of flattening all this curve, this frequency curve here, because we're going to add some top end as well. But again, just making room here in the mid-range for everything else that's already there. And we leave some of this, the bottom end weight of the background vocals in, just so they're not too thin feeling, and we don't want them to feel really scooped sounding. We want to have some of that bottom end in there, so it's not all just top end here. Now, I like to do compression before I boost any top end. I like to boost top end, any kind of air and bite into the compressor here. So I like using this LA2A style compressor, the tube comp, on background vocals, especially background vocals that are really smooth like this. So any kind of oohs or ahs fit really nicely in the track when you push them into this LA2A style compressor. So take a listen without this and then with it. And you can see it brings up some of that bottom end thickness here that we left in around 200, which helps to solidify our background vocals as a package. We're only doing 3 to about 5 dB reduction here at the swell at the end. It helps to even out our background vocals as well, so they're not moving so much. They have some dynamic range to them, so they still swell up into that chorus section, but again, we don't want it to feel like such a drop off when the background vocals disappear here. Just 3 to 5 dB reduction there. Now we're going to go back and we're going to add our top end here. So the first move I like to make is the super highs here. We're adding about 3 dB at 10K. Usually anywhere above 10K is going to sound really nice on any kind of oohs and ahs. It's going to give you that big, bright top end. It's going to give you all that air that you want to hear across the background vocals, across any stack of vocals. So I'm going to hit play and we'll add in this 3 dB boost. It's just that touch of air that's going to help us hear our background vocals without them stepping on anything else inside the track. Now I wanted to add a touch of the high mid area here, just so they're not so transparent, and again, I don't want them to feel scooped sounding, like there's no mid-range or anything here. So a touch of this helps to make sure they feel full range, even though we're pulling out a bunch of the mid-range here. Otherwise, it's just going to feel like super top end and a bunch of air, and I don't want it to feel like that. I want them to have some realism to them, and really airy vocals don't feel real a lot of times in a track. So 2.5 dB at 3K here, just to fill out our frequency range. That's all we need there to help them feel full and to make sure they're not too scooped sounding. Otherwise, they can get covered by everything else, because we're going to have top end air on our lead vocal, right? So if all we have for our vocals to cut, background vocals to cut through, is top end air, they can get lost in the mix, and we'll end up pushing them higher and higher, and then it'll kind of be that we should have just left them as they were at that point. So moving on, the next thing we're doing here, this is kind of the interesting thing about this tactic here. To kind of push them back in the track, I'm putting the reverb directly on the background vocals here. So instead of sending to a reverb, and then I have my background vocals dry and I'm mixing the reverb underneath, I'm putting the reverb directly on the background vocals and using the mix knob here. And it helps to push the vocals back in the mix a little bit. So take a listen here. We're at about 22%. I'm going to A-B it first, and then we'll dial it up. So I'll pull it down to 0%, and we'll kind of dial it in. So what this does, I want you to listen. I'm going to A-B it one more time. Kind of pay attention to the front to rear depth of our track. We've already made room frequency-wise for everything else that's already going in the track, so the background vocals kind of sit around everything else that's going, but when we put the reverb in, suddenly we have a spot in the middle of the mix for our lead vocal. So our background vocals aren't going to sit right on top of our lead vocal. There's kind of a space where our background vocals are going to sit behind, which is what we're going for, right? We want to push our background vocals further back in the track so they're just that kind of ear candy, and they help transition us into our chorus section without stepping on anything else or without giving too much of an impact, so we're not missing anything when we go into our chorus. So listen one more time, pay attention to our front to rear depth as we kick the reverb in here. This is the effect you don't get if you send to a reverb, because if we're sending to a reverb and just pulling the reverb up underneath, we're kind of adding that depth on top of where our background vocals already are, because our dry background vocals are going to stay right where they are, and we're just cooking that reverb up underneath it. Here, we're mixing between them, so we're pulling some of that dry sound out as we add in the fully wet reverb sound. And that's how we get that depth, and we kind of park our background vocals behind our lead vocal. So I'm going to pull this percent all the way down, and we'll ease it back up to where we were. Awesome, and last but not least here, the final thing I like to do, especially when I'm putting any kind of reverb on something, even if it's just on a bus, I like to roll off the bottom end one more time just to make sure there's no heaviness coming out of the reverb return here, or off the reverb. So if it's on a send, I do this kind of same move as well post reverb. I don't want any kind of heaviness coming out of the reverb. We can push bottom end into the reverb if we want, but I don't want any coming out of the reverb. So high pass filter, we're at about 200 hertz, 195 hertz here, just kind of a safety layer. You can hear it just cleans up our bottom end that extra bit to make sure they're not heavy sounding. I don't want any kind of heaviness parked on the side of the track, especially coming out of reverb. That can get muddy sounding. So let's take a listen in the track here. With that reverb on the vocal, pushing them back just a touch in the track, making room for everything else. They're the perfect transition, the perfect ear candy for this pre-chorus section. So let's listen one more time, and I'll A/B our plugins on the background vocals. So if you're trying to get your background vocals to sit further back in your track and just be that airy kind of ear candy, just a couple moves here. We're pulling out all that muddiness and heaviness in the mid-range, adding that shine up in the top end and giving them some fullness. A touch of compression here, so 3 to 5 dB reduction with a smoother compressor, and then putting our reverb directly on the background vocals to move them back in the track. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to go deeper into the vocal mixing process and really start to hone your EQ strategy when it comes to mixing vocals, then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my ultimate guide to vocal EQ, and you can download it below to start creating more professional vocal mixes in less time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.